Hi, welcome to this evening's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Chris Bradley. I'm a senior partner at McKinsey & Co. and a director of the McKinsey Global Institute, or MGI as we call it. The MGI is the independent research arm of McKinsey. We've been producing reports for over 35 years now. But today I'm here as the co-author of this new book, A Century of Plenty, A Story of Progress for Generations to Come. And I'm going to be talking with Callum Williams and Noah Smith about some of the major themes of the book. I'll introduce them more fully in due course. But first, let me just give a quick outline of the central thesis in our book. Also, just so you're aware, tonight's program is being recorded, so kindly ask that you silence your phones for the duration of the program. All right. We started this book by looking back and thinking about the lives of our grandparents. For example, my maternal grandfather, Douglas, grew up through the depths of depression in Dundee, Scotland. He fought a war in North Africa. He married a Greek woman from Alexandria, where my mum was born. He thrived as a young school principal at the British school in Suez, until the Suez Crisis happened and they rushed their way to the shores of Australia, rebuilding a life from scratch, where my mum stepped off the boat in 1952 at age 9. The events that shaped our world, coups, revolutions, wars, depressions, also shaped our families in thousands of small ways, but they added up to the big picture of progress. And as I talk about my grandparents, no doubt you're also thinking about yours. That's the natural reaction, thinking about what their lives were like and what they went through. So but in our book, we looked back and we saw a century of amazing progress. Incomes per person since 1925 grew sixfold, and 40 years were added to life expectancy. Now let's do a different thought experiment. Imagine your grandkids, or maybe their kids, and they're looking back from 2100. The world of 2025 today will seem very strange to them, just as 1925 appears anachronistic to us. What will they see? Will they see another century of plenty, or will they marvel at how different their lives are to ours? Or will they see the plateau of humanity, a planet struggling to breathe, a population in desperate collapse? In our book, we imagine that the world they are in is a wonderful world. A place, let's imagine it, a place with extremely high incomes. All countries are above a floor of $80,000 per year. Highly cohesive societies where people feel safe, where urban life and incredible natural beauty coexist, where the trains are really fast and they run on time. Well, hang on a second. I've actually just described Switzerland today. And the thing about Switzerland, it's real because I've been there. Many of you will have too. I can verify that Switzerland is possible, at least for 9 million people. I'm joined by my co-author today, Nick Lung. He's half Swiss, so he can relate to this. But that's just 1 in 1,000 people on our planet. What about the other 999? So let's consider Burundi, the world's poorest place. Does anyone know anyone from Burundi? Or have you been there? Yeah, I've not been there, but I know a Burundian. It's the world's poorest place. It has income at about 1% the level of Switzerland does. So our Burundians would need annual growth of over 6% for 75 years to be at Switzerland by 2100. And not only that, but in our wonderful world of 2100, the frontier does not stay still. No one wants stagnation. So let's assume that rich countries can go forward at 1.5% a year as well. And at MGI, we like people. We want more of them. So in our model, we've got close to 12 billion people. That's if we manage to stabilize falling fertility rates and prevent disastrous population collapse. So this world of 2100 is going to have to be a lot bigger. In fact, the economy would be 8.5 times bigger than today's economy, 8.5 times bigger. And that leads to the fundamental question we address in this book, which is feasibility. Do we hit the limits of scarcity? So we did the maths. Let me go through the maths with you. First of all, can we have enough stuff? When I first gave this talk, really a practice version of it, one of the people in the audience was an eminent biologist. And he raised his hand and he said, Chris, what you don't understand is that when cultures exist on a petri dish, very, very quickly those cultures multiply at pace. They overwhelm the petri dish and they stabilize or they peter out again. And I kind of blabbed and fluffed my answer. Of course, in the taxi on the way home, I thought of the perfect answer. So I'll give you the right answer now, which is the Earth's petri dish is a magic petri dish. It's magic in two respects. First of all, it's huge. It's absolutely enormous. It's much bigger than we think. 50% of the world's economic activity happens on 1% of its surface. But there's another weird thing about the Earth's petri dish is that it keeps growing. It's not fixed. Let me give a very practical example, copper. We took 800 million tonnes out over the last 100 years, but we added 900 million tonnes into reserves. So it's like a magic cookie jar. We took out lots and lots of cookies, but guess what? The cookie jar is fuller than when we started. And we tested every major commodity. We have the resources even for this very, very big world. But with a fixed mindset, it's not possible. If you think the petri dish is small and fixed, we only have so many scarce reserves, so how can we keep taking them? But we're very, very lucky. The world's not fixed. Copper reserves have doubled just over the last 30 years, for example. And if there's one big lesson from our research this brings to mind, it is that the economy is not a zero-sum game. It's a creativity game. But when we get stuck in that zero-sum world, that's when everything goes bad. Second, can we grow enough food even on a smaller land footprint? This one's really easy. Take rice, for example. We improved over the last 100 years the yield of rice per hectare by 1.5% a year. In order to feed all these people, they're going to have more meat, they're going to have better diets. We only need to grow that by 0.3 a year. So we only need to go at 1/5 the rate. Or another way of looking at it, we only have to get good at growing rice everywhere as Vietnam already is today. We don't have to get quite as good as Australia, which, funnily enough, for a desert place is the best place to grow rice. Go figure that. So food we've taken care of. Thirdly, will there be enough ideas to keep boosting our productivity? Are we all done? Are the big innovations done, the big inventions done? We will need to accelerate productivity growth. The rich world will need to get back to kind of its mojo of the past 60 years and out of the funk of the post-global financial crisis. And catch-up growth will have to happen everywhere, not just China and India, but sub-Saharan Africa too. And really, the ace up our sleeves is going to be AI and its physical manifestation of robots. And in any case, demographic reality will require automation because just here's one stat, by 2050, China will have half of the number of under 25s that it does today. So AI will solve two problems. It will solve a productivity challenge and hopefully a demographic problem too. Then we get to the business end, number 4. Can we get enough clean energy? See, a world where everyone is rich is a world with a lot of energy because there's no way to be rich without having more energy. But how much more? Well, the economy, remember, is going to be 8.5 times bigger in this amazing world. Luckily, we're good at getting more dollars out of energy over time. For example, a Google data center derives 60 times more economic value from an input of energy than an aluminium smelter does. So adding this efficiency factor, even though the world's going to be 8.5 times bigger, we only need 3 times more energy. And that's a lot more energy because the energy system's really big. Now, electricity is the cleanest and most efficient way to deliver energy, sorry. But today, only 20% of energy is electric. So in our world, we push it to 80 because we want more electrification. So electric energy needs to be 12x. Hang on a second, though. It has to be clean too. But clean electricity will need to grow 30x. So that's when we start getting some of these astounding numbers and we ask ourselves, have we broken the model? Have we just disproved our reality? Are we really going to hit limits? So what we did was developed a scenario, well, is it possible? What would it look like physically? And we developed our 40-40-20 scenario. 40% wind and solar plus batteries, 40% nuclear, and 40% everything else. And we kind of did that and said, can we envisage that world working? Let me talk just about nuclear. To do this, you'd need 26,500 nuclear plants, up from 450 today. Now, that feels a really tall order. But imagine if someone from 1925 looked at our 2025 world, they would think that was awfully strange too, wouldn't they? What it really means is you're adding 2% a year of electricity in the form of nuclear, and that's today 70 plants per year versus about 10 we build now, so 7 times. Eventually, you need to be able to ramp up to 350 plants a year on average. It's huge. Is there precedent? Well, funnily enough, the French give us a precedent here. In the 70s and 80s, they built 4 plants a year. They had this incredible nuclear revolution. It's why it's the best and cleanest place to make electricity in the world now. 4 plants a year doesn't sound like much, but if I scale the world, not just France and not just the 1970s economy, but the 2025 economy, the equivalent number is 100. So France did a kind of a 10x rate than we do today. So we've done it before. And China, in fact, 10x'd its electricity in 25 years. And the US, where we are now, added more than an entire Saudi Arabia of oil production in just 20 years. But our current narrative of energy transition just gets it so wrong. We need to do so much more than just replace today's energy. We need to radically grow energy. Our national conversation needs to, and it will, shift from carbon abatement to how do we have an electrification revolution. AI is only going to add to this. For example, in the US in the next 2 years, there's going to be 16 gigawatt scale clusters. So what does that mean? It means the equivalent energy of a city of 1 million houses. So this means whole cities are getting added to the grid in this time. And you add the geostrategic element of AI, and electrification will become a national imperative, and it will be a total shift in the rhetoric. It's already happening. In fact, last year, China added 10 times more new electricity capacity than the US did. Brings us to our 5th issue, which is there enough clean air? And the issue with today's energy system, of course, the externality of emissions. And while a world that stays within the 1.5 degree of warming, aspired to by the Paris Agreement, it doesn't seem possible in any scenario we can see. So we'll admit that. But we show that we can achieve a century of plenty within about 2 or 2.2 degrees. Our argument's simple, though. A vital, growing, rich economy full of technological optimism and the ability to build will be a much better place to create a low-carbon future than, as well as adapting to the weather, than a moribund, sleepy, and divisive economy. Okay, that's the vision. Now, it just feels strange to talk like this, though, because today we have a crisis of hope. The Edelman survey, for example, says that in the US, only 30% of people think that the next generation is going to be better off than the last. And guess what? If you're French, I praised the French before, but French people, only 9% agree with that statement. In China, it's 69%. So not everyone's that gloomy, but the dominant mood is doom and gloom. And in some ways, what we're taking on in this book is a pervasive belief that growth's not good. It produces too much exhaust. That growth's not possible. We've hit planetary limits. And that growth is not for me. It might be for Elon or a billionaire, but growth's not for me. And it is true, we are in a new era, and maybe it feels a bit scary and a bit different. It's a multipolar world. We're heading into demographic winter. Social divisions are heightened. But let's go back again to 1925, where I started the story. How did the world feel then? Our grandparents had absolutely no template of progress like we do now. The century we just saw had never happened in human history. They were between 2 world wars, on the brink of depression, justifiably frightened by the rise of totalitarianism. And death was everywhere. Think of two of the most powerful men in the world, Churchill and Coolidge. Both lost children to needless small infections, one from a stubbed toe during a tennis match and one from a throat infection. Penicillin was invented 3 years later in 1928. So through many difficult chapters and twists in the road, the only thing that in our reading could temporarily stop the machine of progress was collectivism and corruption. And these are political constructs of our own making. We've shown our challenge is not physics or science, it's actually in our hearts and minds. So what's our job? To build a new story, or to quote our book, a story of progress for generations to come. All right, so let's transition to our discussion. For this, I'm joined by Noah and Callum. Please welcome, let me briefly introduce them. Please welcome Noah Smith. After majoring in physics at Stanford, he went on to earn his PhD in economics. He taught finance at Stony Brook, became a Bloomberg columnist before going out on his own and building No Opinion into one of the internet's most influential and, in my opinion, coolest platforms for economics, techno-optimism, and rationality. The only substantive issue that divides us is rabbits. He has a highly critical stance on Australia due to our war on rabbits, which we consider an introduced pest that wrecks our environment. Noah, on the other hand, thinks that rabbits are the best pets and should be defended at all costs. And to moderate our discussion, please also welcome Callum Williams. He's a senior economics writer at The Economist, where he's been since 2014. He collected the trilogy of posh degrees, Cambridge, Oxford, and Harvard. He also wrote an acclaimed book called The Classical School that brings to life the founding fathers of economics and their big ideas. And when I asked Grok to identify the dominant themes in his Twitter posts, it answered skeptical, data-driven takedowns of overhyped economic narratives. So I think I'm in trouble, folks. To the extent I was overhyped just now, things could get quite spicy. So please welcome Noah and Callum's going to moderate our discussion.
Hi, everyone. I know it's here. Right then. Well, thanks all for coming. The book's very interesting. I think to understand the book, it's useful to have a discussion about sort of in a number of ways about how the economy works and how people think about the economy. So that's kind of going to be the nature of my questions. I think given that this is a really nice kind of intimate audience, I think you guys should just feel free to like take your time with your answers. Don't feel you need to have a kind of snappy response, and we can just have a back and forth and try and make it as much of a discussion as possible. So I guess the opening question I had, and this would be for both of you, but I think Chris, I'll start with you, is what are the odds of this happening? Like, if you were to be probabilistic about this, what are the odds that in 100 years' time, Burundi is as rich as Switzerland is today, in your view? And how should we think about that question?
I'll tell you why I think it's a good bet. Now, one of the powers that we adopted in this book, the superpower, was not having to prove that it would happen, but to prove that it could. And that ended up, because actually possibility thinking is, in our view, the doorway into making this work. But let me give you a reason why I think it's a good bet. And that's because the world threw a lot of sand in the gears of progress, almost at every opportunity. We've had world wars, we've had cultural revolutions, we've had pandemics, you name it, you throw it at it. And if anything, as I said, apart from collectivism, the world, appeared anti-fragile in a sense that every shock that happened, if anything, might have produced a lot of bad, but usually also spun us out at a faster rate than we went into it. So on that basis, I would say the lesson of history is that progress is a really, really good bet, because when you have, think about literacy, for example. In 1925, 1/3 of the world was literate. Now almost everyone is, almost 90%. But if we put that in numbers, that's 11 times more literate people. So that means 11 times more people that can communicate with each other and can learn from each other. So you just think the raw ingredients are there for positivity. However, there are spots of the world that are notable examples. You look at China in the 60s, if you look at Venezuela more recently. Spain was half as rich as Venezuela and Argentina in 1950, and now it's twice richer than Argentina and 8 times richer than Venezuela. So while the whole planet's moved forward, it is possible to move backwards. And I met yesterday with some senior policy leaders, and they said, "Oh, Chris, you don't talk about policy enough in this book." And I said, "Yeah, there's a reason for that, because it's right that what the evidence says is there's only one policy that affects growth, and it affects it badly. It's called collectivism." So that it doesn't always go well, but on the whole, it has. Now, where's the big shadow, of course, of the world? Where's the remaining poverty? Where's the remaining lowest life expectancy? Is sub-Saharan Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So the Burundi being, our example of can Burundi be Switzerland, that feels really, really big, because 100 years ago, Switzerland started with a different government setup, a different social fabric, etc. So that's what you need to believe. But you look at Rwanda, look at other places nearby. Rwanda's been growing at 5% plus.
Yeah. Noah, what do you think?
Which exactly?
How likely is it that Burundi will become Switzerland in 100 years?
I don't know. There's a lot, too much uncertainty. I don't really know. But I think that we don't need to set our sights that high. You don't need to be Switzerland to have a decent life. I think that if you can get Burundi to, you know, $20,000 of per capita GDP, purchasing power parity. So if you can get them, if Burundi to where
Brazil,
Mexico
yeah.
or Brazil is right now, that's that'll do, that'll eliminate most material want.
Yep.
In terms of giving people like a decent material standard of living. So I think that's super doable. That's definitely clearly doable. And whether or not it turns into Switzerland, rich countries all look different. Even if Burundi were as rich as Switzerland on paper, it wouldn't look like Switzerland, probably. It wouldn't have the like little streetcars. I mean, not many places do look like Switzerland. So America certainly doesn't look like Switzerland. We are richer than Switzerland on paper, and yet go look at an American city and tell me how you think it looks.
Yeah.
And anyway, so once you get past that sort of level of material satisfaction, I think I become less worried.
Yeah.
And so I think we can get every single country in the world to that baseline level of like everyone has, shelter and food and decent transportation and all the basic stuff they need.
I mean, one thing that has gone under the radar, I think, partly because the West has become much more insular in the past decade, is that Sub-Saharan Africa's had a terrible decade, right? I mean, GDP growth's been very poor. GDP per capita growth's been even worse. So given that's the case, wouldn't it be right to expect that even your more modest goals of Burundi becoming Mexico, Burundi becoming Brazil are still, in a sense, hopelessly optimistic?
Yeah, but China was like half as wealthy as Nigeria was at the start of its economic rise.
Yeah.
South Korea, similar. So there's enough, the problem is that, of course, we can always cherry pick these examples of places that defied all those odds. But, geez, it's not hard to cherry pick them. That's my point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, no. So I think, Africa's past decade has not been great in terms of GDP growth, but the previous decade was the best ever.
Yep.
And so if you average out, you see that since like 1990, for example, right? That was 36 years ago now. Most African countries are significantly poorer than they are now. The economic growth since then has been significant. You've had a large amount of urbanization. You've had basically the average African is much less materially deprived in almost any country you want to look at. Not every single one, but almost any country you want to look at, much less materially deprived than they were 36 years ago. All right, so take 3 more such periods. If we have 3 more such periods that are as good as the last such period, we'll be there.
Yep.
We'll be fine.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good point.
That's a good way of putting it. And then a kind of broader sort of scene-setting question I had for you both as well is you referred to a crisis of hope. I think this is one of the most important political questions actually for the West as a whole. And I take your points about China not being quite the same, but if we just focus on the US, the UK, France, and so on, people have, and you can see this in the consumer confidence surveys, like people have rarely been so angry with the state of the economy and indeed with the state of the world. What are your kind of maybe 2 or 3 best explanations for why we're in this situation? Why are we here? Why does everyone feel this way?
Oh, media. People just read a lot of news and get mad at the news. They read the news, they see negative stuff in the news, they think the world is going to hell in a handbasket. It was always true to some degree.
Yeah.
And in 1985, you'd read your morning paper, you'd be like, the world's going to hell in a handbasket, and then you'd just close your newspaper, and then you'd go to work, and you'd be then you'd be offline, and you'd interact with people around you who are mostly doing fine in a world that's mostly doing fine. Now you have this thing in your pocket all the time, and you're doom scrolling on social media, and then media always had a negativity bias. Negative news always sold better than positive news. No news is good news was always a line for this reason. And so now you've got every social media shouter and little entrepreneur on Twitter and on TikTok and on whatever other news you're watching, legacy media, whatever, everyone is trying to tell you the world is going to hell because that's what gets your eyeballs, and they want your eyeballs. And the increased competition for your eyeballs has only forced them to go negative harder and, more dramatically. And so, this thing is telling you the world's going to hell, but the world is not going to hell. Various parts of the world are going somewhat to hell, but that was always true. That was true in 1985. That was true. There was not really maybe there are a few years in the 90s where for most places in the world, like things seemed a little more optimistic, but like overall, it's, things are not worse in terms of war, in terms of disease, in terms of famine, in terms of crime, in terms of, suicide, overdoses. Like overdoses are falling, traffic accidents are falling, crime is falling, suicide's falling, all these things, like who knows that? You don't, because that doesn't get your clicks. That doesn't get your eyeballs. And so people are reading the news and thinking that the world's going to hell, but it's not.
100%. Like slow and steady progress just doesn't make the front page. That's absolutely true. I'd also add, if you go back to a time of gloom, and it's funny, the transition we're in now into this new era of multipolarity, etc., kind of rhymes in many ways with like the early 70s when, US left the gold standard. You had, retreat in shame from Vietnam, and obviously a massive energy shock. So there's a lot of and inflation outbursts. But it was around that time that the Club of Rome came up with all this kind of idea that, limits to growth. And so, there's something in the human condition that I think has a scarcity framing. It's probably some survival instinct.
Yeah.
And the thing that's really revved that up again in the modern world is the whole topic of climate change, which in our book we had to deal with really head on. And that is because it basically says, listen, whatever you think about growth, who cares if if the head of the UN refers to it as global boiling, which is complete hyperbole, by the way. Then it's no wonder that people go, well, I don't want global boiling, and that the nasty economy produced global boiling, so maybe growth is bad, or there's not enough.
Yeah.
And then the other topic that kind of seeds into this kind of growth not good or not possible is this idea I opened up within my early remarks, which is this feeling, and I don't know how much reality is that kind of growth not for me, that it's a very unequal world. We should get into that more deeply, but I have to say from a overall global perspective, the world's never been more equal than it is today.
Yeah.
But that we should probably get into the whole inequality.
Well, let's do it now, because I'm not. I mean, the media explanation for disappointment and anger is commonly cited, but the trends to me just don't seem coincident. I mean, you've had the spread of social media and smartphones for really quite a long time, but what you've seen particularly in terms of consumer confidence is it's really quite a recent trend, right? This is something that happened really in 2022. Then say in this country, 2022, 2023, all-time low consumer confidence. We read that as just generally being kind of pissed off about the economy, a bit of a rise, and then another massive decline recently. Now, to me, that says more about, I think, macroeconomic conditions. I mean, even waiting outside this hall before this started, I overheard a conversation with two people saying, I can't remember who, hopefully you won't feel exposed, but I went to get 2 tacos and a margarita and it cost $50, and it's like completely outrageous. Like, how can that possibly cost $50? So there is this view that I think you're identifying, that growth doesn't have any benefit for me, the guy who just, or the woman who just goes to work and tries their best and tries to raise a family or whatever, has a dog or whatever. So why is that feeling now so widespread? And that strikes me as very crucial to understanding.
Do you want to? I mean, you talk a lot about this now. Do you want to?
It appears to be looking at you, but
no, either. I'm looking at both of you. I'm always looking at both of you, unless I say explicitly otherwise.
Okay. Why is consumer confidence low? Nobody knows. The leading theory until pretty recently was interest rates.
Yeah.
Borrowing costs are high.
Yeah.
That theory might still be right, because we're not sure exactly which interest rate to look at. The federal funds rate has been decreased slightly, but mortgage rates respond with a lag, and auto loan rates, credit cards respond with a lag. So it could be that borrowing costs are still going up for your average person. Now, borrowing costs used to be counted in CPI sort of accidentally through a measure of housing costs that included the cost of a mortgage. But interest rates have never really been included formally in CPI, but it still is something that feels like a price to a
Yep.
lot of people, the price of credit, the price of borrowing money.
Yep.
Even if it's not the price of a final goods and service, like a loan. You don't eat a loan, but like you need a loan sometimes. And so that was kind of this, Larry Summers did this, he had this paper saying, oh, it's interest rates. Maybe that's true. We'll have to wait out of sample to see if that's true. It also could be that people are just pissed off about policy. They see tariffs, they see things, they see that the intentions of the government are not things that would make things better. The government seems to be trying to break things, trying to disrupt their life, right? It could even be pessimism about like AI. Oh no, we're going to lose all our jobs or something. Like, I don't actually know what it is. There is some international evidence showing that that interest rates do contribute to economic pessimism. High interest rates contribute to economic pessimism in other countries around the world. So at least that's sort of robust in that sense. But I don't really know, like, in terms of people's actual like material well-being, in terms of consumption. Most of those things are still going up.
Yeah.
Like if you look at, tacos cost $50, whatever. But if you look at the actual number of tacos that people are eating,
Sure.
and then you say, oh, well, they're just borrowing, mortgaging their whole future to eat $50 tacos, but they're not. Savings rates are okay, and wealth has gone up. At the median, I'm not talking about Elon Musk here, but at the median, wealth has gone up, savings have gone up. The burden of debt service. If you look at the actual burden of debt service, how much people are paying to service their debts every month, we are back down to the rates of like, I don't know, the early 2000s, where, before all the Great Recession, housing crisis, deleveraging, and all that stuff. We're back down to a reasonably low level of debt service. People aren't paying that much money every month to service their debts. And so, now I don't know.
Yeah. Can you help us solve the puzzle?
I think inflation is really, really matters. And in the long run, inflation reflects productivity. That's why anyone who's pro cost of living needs to be pro productivity. And you do see stuff like, if you make a basket of things that the bottom quintile buys, the inflation rate is higher in that basket because it's more services intensive. And, the basics like rent and health and education have been inflationary because we haven't cracked, in a way, in our book, we talk about this thing called the machine of progress, because it's not just, we don't just admire and go, wow, the world was good, because in order to repeat something, you need to know how you did it the first time, right? If you're practicing your scales, you need to know why did you get it right? And the thing is that it was really large private enterprises, and shock horror, McKinsey says the superhero of the world is mega corporations, but in some ways it is. And it's the places where actually large private enterprises have struggled to get a foothold are the places where we've got major cost of living problems.
Yeah.
It's not the opposite way. The politicians would probably try and paint it the other way around, but they're flat wrong. But we at MGI, we use a thing called the empowerment line. And that's a line which is, the poverty line, but that's a bit arbitrary. What we do is we try and add up, like, what does it cost to live an economically empowered life where you have choices and you have a bit of a buffer. And in most developed countries, like the US, there's about 20% up to 30% below the empowerment line. And when you draw the correlation, as you grow the economy more, you don't lift as many people out of empowerment because affordability, because they're really thriving. Like, what we want is a really high wage.
What's the empowerment line? Can you explain that?
It's basically, for each country, we built a basket of like, what do you need to live an economically empowered life? So I think
Empowered me?
it means you can educate your children, you can afford insurance, it's like a bread line. So in our world, current analysis is about half, 53% of the world is below the empowerment line and 47% above. So we wanted to set a higher bar than just the poverty line. But the point is, for people below the empowerment line, they do feel inflation more.
Yep.
There's absolutely no question about that. I do think there's a bigger social thing though around what this great mystery of why material wealth creates pessimism. And my sense is there's a vicious cycle to it. And this is a bit of a theory, but the vicious cycle is as material wealth becomes taken for granted, more abundant, there's kind of a forgetfulness of why, and there becomes a preoccupation with redistribution.
Mm-hmm.
And a preoccupation with redistribution creates a lot of government intervention, it creates a lot of regulation, it creates a lot of X, Y, Z. And you get a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy because that slows down that slows down growth. And that's why, and I'm not trying to advocate any particular political persuasion. What I'm trying to get people to focus on is let's make sure we understand the machine of progress and have confidence that actually if companies do R&D and spend CapEx, that turns up in really, really good ways in our national well-being. So, for example, we did a report last year called The Power of One that showed that only about a tiny handful of companies, with about 5%, explain almost 80% of productivity growth. For example, in the US, there's 2.5 million retail companies. You might not believe this, but just 6 of them explain more than half of the productivity improvement of that sector. So we need to find ways to create a world where there's lots of R&D and lots of investment, and then that's what creates the social goods afterwards.
Yeah, come on.
So another interesting hypothesis, I don't know how much I believe this, but then I was talking about this with a friend of mine named David Marks. He lives in Japan and writes about culture. Interesting guy. He said he thinks it's all about social comparisons. He thinks that a lot of how well we think we're doing is looking at other people and comparing ourselves to them. Now go back to 1985, and who would you compare yourself to? You compare yourself to your coworkers, maybe your boss. You compare yourself to your neighbors, the people who live in your neighborhood. You compare yourself to your family, maybe your old friends from like college or whatnot, right? But now you go online and you look at the lives of the rich and famous on Instagram. Okay, but maybe not. Maybe it's not that. Maybe you're just seeing random people making TikTok videos about their daily life and how they're getting like $50 tacos at the, walking around New York. And how do you know who to compare yourself to? Like there were always, back in the day, there were people much richer than you, but you never met them. Right? You met your boss who was a bit richer than you. You had people down the street on the slightly nicer street that had slightly bigger houses than you, but you didn't see, people who were 5 times as rich as you, talking about their $50 tacos on a TikTok video. Now you do. But maybe if you knew, oh, this person like is an AI researcher, so of course they'd be buying $50 tacos, but you don't know that. You don't really know what they are, what they do. They're dislocated. They're, decontextualized. And so David's theory, and again, I don't know how much I endorse this. I just heard it and I have to think about it. I've seen no evidence for this. But David's theory is that basically people are comparing themselves online. And so there is one interesting survey where you ask people how much money would you need to live a good life. And then for every generation until Gen Z, it increases a little bit, increases at about the rate that like income actually increased, right? Maybe a little slower actually. So that, millennials are like, oh, you need $160,000 to lead a good life, and Generation X is like, oh, you only need $120,000, something like that, right? And then you look at Gen Z and it's $500,000. And this could be because young people are bad at taking surveys, they don't know anything, but when I was 22 and you would ask me like how I just graduated college and how much would I need to live a good life? It was like not even $100,000 a year, certainly, right? At that time. And then in no way would I have given an answer that said the inflation adjusted. Now maybe I'm smarter. I went to Stanford and read on the internet. I knew a little bit more about what was going on, and your average person would have said a lot more money. I don't think so, though. I don't think so. It's weird that Gen Z people said they needed $500,000 a year to live a good life on that survey. That's weird. And it makes me think maybe David's right. Maybe people are looking at the lifestyles of people much richer than them on TikTok or whatever platform, and they're seeing people live much richer lives than them, and they're saying, why don't I live that rich? And if so, you can have all the research and development in the world, all the progress and growth you want, all the material well-being you want. It's not going to do a damn thing because people are still going to be making these inappropriate comparisons, these decontextualized comparisons on social media. If David's right, what do we do about that other than blow up the internet, which is my solution to a lot of things. But
I like your point about comparison's good though, because I had tacos for lunch and I paid $18.
Well, come on.
I feel so good because I got such a good deal.
Consumer surplus. Would you have paid $50?
Well, that leads to your classic.
We'll never know.
The classical definition of happiness is earning more than your wife's sister's husband, isn't it? Something like that.
Yeah.
Earning more than your wife's than your brother-in-law. Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
So,
Doesn't this mean that
I won't comment on how happy I am.
I definitely do. But my brother-in-law is probably happier. He's a very happy guy.
You're kind of neurotic, though.
I'm not neurotic.
I'm joking.
I just read too much news.
Yeah, you do.
So how do we get a political constituency for growth? I mean, the other thing that I worry about and have written about a bit is that it strikes me that because of population aging, we have a large section, basically baby boomers and above, who have no real vested interest in having economic growth at all, because all it does is create disruption in their lives, and they frankly don't get to share in any of the benefits. So, whenever there's any kind of proposal for some kind of redevelopment in San Francisco, you go to the planning meeting. To be frank, the average age is somewhat older than me, and the objections are quite familiar, and as a result, nothing ever gets.
Well, these are the insiders that freeze out the outsiders, and in my country, which has the highest house prices in the world, we really feel that. I think reality just smacks us in the face, and there's a few realities. The first one is geostrategic competition, which I said in my opening remarks that, electricity used to just be this thing that happened, and, but now it has become the equivalent of the nuclear arms race.
Yeah.
Because the country that is supreme in AI is the supreme country, and there's more competition. And China built 10 times more new electricity last year than the US did. And so necessity of geostrategic competition actually means a lot. And when, I work a lot with corporations, and there we talk about a competitive context, it really matters. But cozy monopolistic governments that have a monopoly on violence, they also can be a problem. And in some ways, geostrategic competition is quite helpful for that. It's scary, but quite helpful in creating necessity. Think of the space program, but think what's going to happen in the US now with electrification. I think it's enormously exciting.
Yeah.
And to your point about building, I mean, let's take nuclear, which we talked about as one potential technology in the book. By the way, we open-minded to the idea that new technologies would come along, because if you were in 1925, you didn't know about liquefied natural gas, you didn't know about nuclear energy. So there's still surprises down the road for us. But South Korea got their act together and said, we need nuclear power. Obviously they do, because they have to import all their energy. And they built 12 plants in a row, all of the same, and they did it 1/3 the cost that the US does.
Mm-hmm.
So at the moment, the US can kind of afford to dilly-dally around. But when it becomes very, very serious, the US will become better than South Korea at making nuclear plants.
Yeah.
That geostrategic necessity. And then the other one is the other point is markets always have a habit of kind of surprising us with their optimism, because, at the moment, I think just 6 companies in the US are investing in R&D and CapEx about $700 billion a year. The Apollo program was about 300, but that was over 13 years. So in America right now, 6 companies are doing 2 Apollo programs per year. And just think of the social, scientific, cultural imprint that the Apollo program left behind. I'm not saying what Meta's doing is as good as Apollo, but I'm just using the numbers. This is amazing. And, this all happens despite. And when you go to Europe and they go, which by the way has a $400 billion investment gap in their large companies versus the US, the diagnosis is so simple. It's Europe doesn't like large companies. It's just incredible. We've done so much analysis on it. It's just very simple. But by necessity, Europe is going to have to fall in love with large companies again. So my sense is one of the reasons the world has been so resilient to these shocks is the combination of bolt from the blue technological change and geostrategic competition meant that these little petty arguments they kind of got gazumped.
Yeah, very, very interesting.
Gezumped?
Discarded.
Is that
made irrelevant?
Got it. All right.
That's a word that you get in the UK as well.
Gazumped is if you go to an auction and you thought you won it, but then someone behind the scenes.
Right. Well, it's in housing mainly in the UK. Yeah.
Gazumped. Is that not a word here?
No, never heard of it. That's the first time.
Yeah.
That's good.
It was lovely to hear you say data, Chris, earlier, by the way.
Yeah.
I haven't heard that for a while.
That?
That's data, or data, as you'd say.
Oh.
Yeah.
Darter.
It's like maths rather than math.
Like a snail darter.
Yeah.
Like maths. All 10 of them. Anyway.
So it seems to
you
me
don't say mathematic. You say mathematic.
Well, exactly.
Yes, but that's only out of deference, like the Greeks or something. Anyway. All right.
So it sounds as though we need some kind of shock, right? So either it's
we got it.
Well, did we though? Because I mean, there's this meme of nothing ever happens, right? No one's actually experienced a true kind of shock on the scale of, say, Sputnik or Pearl Harbor. To be frank,
Have you used a chatbot lately?
I mean, I know we all have. I don't think I don't think that's a shock really. People are just inured to technological change.
Software engineers about to get a shock.
Well, apparently.
Software engineering's done.
Do you think so?
Oh yeah. Linus Torvalds is vibe coding.
Computers can speak English now.
No, I'm aware of what they can do, but I would question the
Better than us.
yeah.
Well,
Well,
they get
no.
their grammar correct. They say data. Yeah.
Yeah.
They do say darter.
So how optimistic then are you? If we're going to have if AI is this kind of Deus ex machina that's going to one of the things that's going to save us from a slow growth stasis? What's your sort of timeline for that? I mean, I think there were a lot of people especially in San Francisco, who tried ChatGPT for the first time in November 2022, and thought, okay, give it a year, maybe 2, maybe 3, we'll definitely see big changes. We're still not there at the moment, far from it. So
I think we are. Well, maybe not the size.
Okay.
Of people were throwing out some ridiculous numbers. Like people were saying 20% growth a year, but that's just some silly person being effusive and making up some number off the top of their head.
yeah,
And when people were like, no, here's what that would require, it was not realistic. However, I do think we're seeing benefits to growth already from AI. I think we're already starting to see it.
okay, I'd
absolutely.
say that's a niche view. I don't think there's really any evidence of that at all. I mean, not least because a very small fraction of companies, not just big companies, companies as a whole, are using AI in any kind of meaningful way. I mean, it's just not at scale in deployment.
I don't think that's true. I think that a lot of people are using AI at work personally.
Sure,
When you look at
absolutely,
ChatGPT,
yes.
I mean, you're
I think I'm probably more
consultant, so
pessimistic about what people do at work.
yeah, but I go.
productivity growth is looking pretty good.
Okay, well, let's not worry about what I think. So what? So
No, but I go into companies, and that's what we do at the moment. Is we work out how to improve their processes with AI. It's very real. I agree with you though. The interesting that's happened is AI is getting more and more intelligent.
Yeah.
If you look at this test of everything, what's those 2,500 questions? The hardest test on earth. or
Last
whatever it's called,
exam.
The last exam.
Yeah.
I
If you
didn't pay attention to it. I thought it was a gimmick. I thought, oh, they're making something that AI will just do next week, which is true.
if you follow the line,
They're all gimmicks.
if
All the
you follow the line, we're 19 months away from it being able to be smarter than a stadium full of professors, basically.
Yeah.
Anything smarter.
But at tests, which is no, but here's the point: at tests, which is structured. So at structured things, it's really good, and it's improving really fast. My favorite meme on AI is this person holding up a mushroom to AI and saying, "Can I eat this mushroom?"
Sure.
And then there's a RIP grave, and AI goes, "You're right, you can't eat that mushroom. Darn it." But don't forget this $700-800 billion a year that's going into this system. So the AI we have now is like this light from yesterday's stars coming. Like what's coming is a really big deal. But the interesting that's happened, as fast as AI's improved, our definition of intelligence has also shifted, because the first definition made in the 40s or whatever was the Turing test, which is, could you tell it was a computer talking to you or not? ChatGPT passed that straight away. But what we're finding is that actually what humans...
That one was too easy. People are like, the average person is so dumb, that was probably passed by like chat bots in like the 80s.
But my point is this. What we found is the definition, each benchmark, we have to keep changing, because the reason is we don't know how to define human intelligence.
Sure.
And so we use things like tests, which are incredibly structured.
Yeah.
And then we go, okay, how do you create economic value? It's not very structured. There are structured parts.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you look at automation through history, what it is taking the structured parts and automating them, and then people find more unstructured things to do, like these panels that's not structured. And so I think what we'll see, and that's why I'm massively bullish both for wages, because if you walk out of the lift in the morning and you've got the knowledge of the world in your pocket, you'll get a higher wage, not a lower wage, right? And my sense is, and MGI's thinking, talks more about collaboration with machines than replacement. But the definition of intelligence keeps moving, because we find out that actually humans solve implicitly so many little gaps in what they do that measuring it based on a very specific structured activity isn't so helpful.
Mm-hmm.
But what we'll see is like someone's job, you have to do 25 things
Mm-hmm.
I think,
to get... You go ahead.
No,
I just think that's quite a profound observation, Chris. And I think to be blunt, I'm not sure you're following through with the implications of that observation for how you view AI's
No,
impact on
because
the
it's a
economy.
massive boost of productivity. If you take my idea that, you got to get 25 things done in your job, and AI comes along and does 15 of them incredibly well, your productivity actually goes up massively, so you become more valuable, but there's still 10 remaining things you have to do, and
Yeah.
those things become more valuable.
Yeah.
So my analogy is a Porsche, which is a great car. I'd love to have a Porsche 911. I don't. But if you've got a Porsche 911, it's got 3 wheels. That car is worth 0 in economic value.
Mhm.
But if you come along and you have the wheel, then you suddenly become worth a lot. You become worth $250,000, right? Does that make sense?
Sure.
And in my view, humans are people walking around with that missing wheel. And as that Porsche gets better and better, we only become more and more valuable. But just the idea that your definition that for AI to be useful, it needs to replace everything human does is crazy. I think it just needs to enhance us. And, my sense is if you're a wheel owner in a world of 3-wheeled Porsches, you're very valuable.
To be clear,
Let me give
yeah,
it.
you go. Yeah.
When you invent the drill press, one of the most useful machines ever invented, nobody was saying, "Well, this machine can't even tie my shoes for me." You were saying, "Oh my God, I can do this and this and this and this and this," and nobody was saying, "Oh, it's not an everything doer, so therefore this is a useless machine." No one said that. Why are we judging AI differently than that? If this is a drill press for the
100%.
mind, then that's really good. Like we got from the Industrial Revolution, which amplified our physical power and gave us the power to do all these physical tasks we couldn't previously do. We got a century and a half of massive productivity growth that took us from an animal existence to the current existence that we in the first world enjoy now.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
AI could do the same for mental work, that would be insanely good. And without and also think about the people in Burundi with regards to AI, right? A person in Burundi can now write better than I can. I'm a highly paid, well-respected writer, and yet on some topics I can write better, something better than an AI would write for you. But on 99.9% of topics, a random Burundian sitting there with a cell phone and a GPT subscription or a Gemini subscription or whatever can now write better than me on 99.9% of all topics in the world. On sports, say sports. A Burundian can now write a better article about sports than I can by pressing a button. Okay, that's incredible. And I don't know whether people are going to actually pay all the Burundians to do that.
I'm gonna guess not.
Maybe not, but then there's lots of difficult to answer questions like general equilibrium and how demand will shift and things like that. But the point is that we have this assumption that technology benefits only the really super well educated and connected and smart people, because that's kind of what happened with the internet, with the last wave of technology. But when you look at what industrial technology did, it was the master weavers and the master cobblers who their human capital got devalued and everybody got really mad at the time, because then a random person could weave better than a master weaver just by working this power loom. And so people are like, "Rrr, angry at that, we'll smash power looms," but it didn't work. And so now we're going to see that with mental stuff and these free rents that have gone to people who are good at acting like a computer day in and day out at work may disappear. And then your average schmo throughout the world may be drastically empowered by the democratization of intelligence, of machine tools that do knowledge work.
I think so. Can I go back in a bit to like the history lesson?
Yeah.
Because the lesson but technology change, newsflash, is not new. It's why we're here. And so if you go back 100 years ago, what the world of work looked like is that 70% of work was physical in 1925. And now only about less than 40 is. But if you take a class of jobs we call cognitive non-routine, which means kind of, work of the brain that's creative, has tripled from about 15% of the workforce to about 45%. So as we automate,
I didn't realize it was that big.
yeah. So as we've automated, the world, all that happened is humans moved on to do stuff that was utterly more and more human. And that, and I think that's incredible. I think that will continue. The thing that I'm very excited about for AI is its possibility in discovery, because we often think about, replacing today's activity. We know that's a completely wrong way to look at it, right? Like your profession of being a professional blogger didn't exist before blogs, right? So there's new jobs come along.
I would submit that there were people like bloggers, but yes.
Yeah. Okay. So
Galileo,
bad
basically
example.
an angry blogger.
Yeah. Yeah.
Blogging's dangerous. You can get in trouble for blogging.
But in the spirit of discovery, we keep talking about, can it do a credit note for a bank as well as and by the way, it can. But in terms of doing science, like think about one of the reasons for optimism in the world, how many scientists there are in the world today. Now, actually, the big question mark is why have we got so many more scientists in the world today, like millions and millions more, but we're not finding more and more drugs, right? But, there's already people building whole molecule by molecule models, AI models of the human body, so we know what's going to happen when you throw a molecule in it. We're learning ways of folding proteins that we've never discovered before. And so, just the productivity element of just better R&D is going to be unbelievable. I do think that, for example, one of my MGI teams was doing a report recently called Agents, Robots and Us. It's just out, very good report. But they were trying to convince me that mechanics were a physical job that machines can do now. And kind of like, if you look technically it is, but I'm like, I love my Jeep. And if you've ever tried to unplug an electrical component in the engine of a Jeep, if you ever think a robot can do that, it's got to be the most expensive robot in the world because it's bloody hard. So my sense is a lot of those routine things that are fiddly and difficult, so many gaps involved, they'll take a long time to replace.
Yeah.
But things like R&D, I think we're going to see. So it's going to happen in places you least expect, and maybe coding also.
Coding.
If software becomes something that everybody can do,
It is today.
Yeah.
It's not if it will become. It has become.
Yeah.
If you download Claude Code, everyone in this room is a professional quality software engineer.
Yeah.
You can do it tonight.
I vibe coded a game. I think it's hard to vibe code a whole enterprise system.
Yeah.
And it's hard to vibe code like something that's going to stand up regulatory scrutiny. But the building blocks are there. Again, let's remember, like we got till 2100 to achieve this. And again, going back to the lessons of it's the small compound interest. Like average productivity improvement in humanity is somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 per year.
Yeah.
And that was enough to create abundance in the world. And we just got to keep that going.
Yeah. So I'm going to add one thing and use the privilege of being the chair to say the last thing, and then I'm not going to allow you to respond, which is that I think the reason you both fall down here is because you rely too heavily on technological shocks to facilitate improvements in income. And I think what your book shows very well is that you've got to have the complementary shocks of the institutions, the culture, the politics. And that is indeed exactly what happened in the Industrial Revolution. There was no single technology in the Industrial Revolution that caused the Industrial Revolution. It was a combination of all kinds of things, including political changes. This is the reason I asked these questions at the start about, like, will people become invested in growth? Is because I think that has to change too if AI is going to reach its potential. But I am going to turn to a question.
I agree with that thing.
From YouTube.
I'm using all my discipline not to respond.
Good, thank you. And then after this question, I'd love to come to the rest of the audience. So a question from YouTube. I don't know who it's from. I don't know their name, I'm afraid. And I guess this is mainly targeted at you, Chris, but no, please chime in as well. What gives you confidence that human institutions will be able to do what's needed in response to climate change, ever more destructive weapons, and AI risks? That's the question.
So, I mean, climate change, I don't think will be solved by institutions. Paris Agreement was struck 10 years ago. Emissions are up 8.5% since then. The biggest 4 emitters, US, India, Russia, and China, are more than half of emissions. None of those have net zero 2050 targets. Of the other 6, 3 of them, Brazil, Indonesia, and Iran, undid all the work that Germany, Japan, and Canada did. So it won't be solved by institutions because institutions can't override realpolitik, and climate change is going to get re-litigated every time you go to the ballot box. So I think we'll see the UK, Germany, Australia really pull, which are very kind of virtuous net zero economies, really pull back from that. So why do I say that without quivering or like going red in the face with fear? Is two things. First of all, long run we can solve it. We've shown in this book that the technologies are there and we will solve it. And markets are really good at solving stuff. Like for example, in China, 2018 and I think it was 2014 and 15. I might have the year wrong. They poured more cement in China in those 2 years than the whole of the US did in the entire 20th century. And there was no newspaper article about, oh my God, the cement revolution. What, like markets are really good at doing stuff. Like we had 500 million people move into cities in China. And again, there wasn't a news report. Oh, 100,000 people moved into the cities there. That wasn't in the news. Markets are incredible at doing big things, and they absolutely will. And the second reason is, and MGI has research just published on this now on adaptation, which is if you care about climate resilience, you should mostly care about economic development because economic development comes with inbuilt adaptation. But what we found is that adapting to a 2-degree world is remarkably cheaper than we expected. We think it's a 1.2 trillion in 2050 to adapt to a 2-degree world. That's $120 a person. It's not, that's cheap. And
Like a monthly deficit in the US, right?
it's cheap. But the really interesting thing about it is actually we're only 1/3 protected to today's weather. And most adaptation spend is really good. You know what the biggest spend is? It's air conditioners and it's irrigation, things that make life great.
What about fires? Is that included?
Yeah, fire control's there, but it's actually rainfall flooding is the third one that matters the most. It's not coastal things there. And let's remember, like the Netherlands literally lives underwater, and I don't know if you've ever been to the Netherlands. What a pleasant place. Very rich too. So adaptation is cheap. Economic development comes with adaptation built in. And in the long run, the technological curves we see, you talk about this. No, all the technology curves say that electric technologies will win. Now, what we've been told though is this narrative that if we go above 1.5, we're all kind of fry. And I just don't. The only evidence I have for this room, I don't want anyone to get too upset, is what most people don't understand is we're already 1.2 or 1.3 into that 1.5. So we're kind of very close to that 1.5 world. And humanity has never thrived as it has before. We've never had faster greening. We've never had more reforestation. We've slowed down biodiversity loss at an absolutely enormous amount.
That's true.
And 1/10 of and the percentage of people who die from weather-related incidents is down by 90%. So that's where I get it from. Now I know that's not the political narrative because again you've got the head of the UN calling it global boiling. I just don't think that helps us.
Yeah.
It's a very real problem to solve. And if one thing about being from MGI is you read the footnotes. And so we actually read the IPCC thoroughly. And all our work is based on IPCC science. And it's just not as dramatic in the footnotes as it is in the headlines.
Yeah. We only have a few minutes left. So are there any questions from the audience? We would love to have some.
No, what's your take on climate optimism?
I'm pretty optimistic about climate stuff. I think
You're optimistic about solar. You think solar is going to...
Oh, yeah, easily. And then I think electricity part is basically solved. It's steel, cement, industrial heating, and to some extent agriculture. I think it's those are kind of the battle lines now.
Yeah.
I think that what we have to do is focus on spending a lot of money on research into the relevant technologies, at some point a scaling curve takes over, and then hopefully us, but more likely China, will make a lot of it.
I have another question for you, Noah. Noah has written recently that, quote, the global order is disintegrating. The question is, what if this fragmentation and lack of cooperation continues? How would this impact the model, by which I mean the kind of premise of the book?
Well, the global order has disintegrated a few times before, and each of the last few times that happens, growth ended up accelerating, partly because of geopolitical competition between states, partly because of the institutions we discovered in order to get ourselves out, like the research stuff we invented for World War II and the industrial stuff we invented in infrastructure and things like that we invented for war. was actually helpful for growth ultimately, and ultimately for good institutions in the West and bad institutions in some communist countries. But then, so things don't always go right. Like if you lived in, Russia, things didn't go right. Living in Russia means you've seen things go wrong again and again and again for like over 100 years. So I can't say that things are always going to just go right. I'm not panglossing about it. I've seen institutional failure compound on failure in Russia. But then I've seen, America kept getting better and better for a long time, and Japan kept getting better and better for a long time. And then a lot of places kept getting better and better. And so I think it's not set. I don't think there's a law of the universe about what happens here with institutions. I think that different things could happen. At this point, it becomes useful to talk about free will. Because so many different things could happen, we just have to say it's up to us.
Anything to add, Chris? And I think this
No,
could
that's
be
the
a final word.
That's the punchline of our book.
Yeah.
We need a story of progress for generations to come, and ultimately, it's not physics, it's not science that will get in the way to our hearts and minds. And so, what we need is a new narrative of progress.
That's very rousing call. Noah and Chris, thank you very much, and thank you all for listening.